It was the summer of 1997 when I decided to take a break from the city. I was 32 then, and after years of working in a cramped office in downtown Portland, Oregon, I felt worn down and drained. I needed to get away from everything, the noise, the endless crowds, the constant rush. So I rented a small cabin deep in the woods of the Cascade Mountains. The place was far enough from any town that you couldn't hear cars or sirens, just the sounds of nature. The kind of place where you could almost forget the world existed. The cabin itself was old but sturdy. Built sometime in the late 1960s, it had rough wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and a porch that wrapped around two sides. The windows were thick and covered with heavy curtains, and there was a single door with an old iron latch. The road to get there was a bumpy dirt path that twisted through dense pine trees, and the only signs of human life were an abandoned fire pit and a faded wooden sign that read Clearview Cabin. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows between the trees, and the air was cool and damp. I carried my backpack, a small cooler, and a stack of firewood up to the cabin. As I opened the door, a faint smell of pine mixed with old wood filled my nose. The floor creaked under my boots as I stepped inside, setting down my things. The cabin was empty, except for a simple wooden table, two chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, and a small stove. There was no electricity, no running water. Just the basics. I set to work making the place feel livable. I stacked the firewood by the hearth and started a small fire to warm the room. Outside, I could hear birds chirping and the distant rustle of animals moving through the brush. The sky darkened quickly, and soon I was sitting by the firelight, reading a paperback book I brought along. The silence outside was deep, different from the usual city quiet. It wasn't empty, it felt alive, watching. The first night was strange but not frightening. I woke several times, hearing the sounds of branches tapping the cabin's walls and small animals scurrying nearby. I told myself it was just the forest doing what forests do, but there was a knot in my stomach I couldn't shake. It wasn't fear exactly, but unease. Something was off. The next day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. I packed a small backpack with water, snacks, and a flashlight. The sun was bright and warm as I walked through the thick woods, the ground soft with moss and fallen leaves. The trees were tall, their tops lost in a haze of green. I followed an old trail that curved away from the cabin, hoping to find a stream or maybe a clearing. After about an hour, I stumbled upon an old logging road, barely visible through the overgrowth. It looked like no one had used it for years. The air smelled wetter here, and I could hear the faint sound of running water. I pushed forward, the bushes scraping my arms. When I finally broke through the trees, I found a small creek, the water clear and cold as it bubbled over smooth stones. I sat by the creek for a while, soaking in the peace. The light filtered through the branches in bright patches, and I watched a pair of squirrels dart from tree to tree. It felt like the kind of place where time stood still. After a while, I stood and headed back toward the cabin, careful to mark my path so I wouldn't get lost. That evening, as the sky darkened, I made a bigger fire outside on the porch and cooked some canned beans over it. The stars were bright and scattered across the sky like diamonds. I felt a rare calm, but that knot in my stomach was still there, tightening a little. The third day was when things started to feel truly wrong. I woke early to the sound of something scratching outside. At first, I thought it was a raccoon or maybe a bird pecking at the wood. But when I looked out the window, there was nothing there. The forest was still, the trees silent in the morning light. I told myself again it was just an animal, nothing more. I spent the day reading and exploring more around the cabin. I found an old hunting trail not far from the logging road. The trail was overgrown but walkable. I followed it for a while, the woods growing thicker and darker as I went deeper in. The air was cooler under the canopy, and I noticed strange marks on the trees. Deep scratches that didn't look like they were made by animals. The sun was dipping low when I decided to head back. On the way, I caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees. Just a shadow, nothing clear. My heart sped up, but when I stopped and looked closely, there was no one there. Back at the cabin, I double-checked the doors and windows. Everything was locked tight. I made a fire inside and sat close to it, staring into the flames. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's thin walls. I could hear twigs snapping nearby and faint footsteps crunching on the dirt just beyond the porch. I didn't sleep well that night. Every noise made me jump, and I kept imagining eyes watching me from the dark woods. On the fourth day, things escalated. I woke to the sound of the front door opening. My heart stopped. I wasn't expecting anyone. I grabbed the small hatchet I'd brought for chopping firewood and crept to the door. But when I pulled the curtain aside, no one was there. The door was slightly ajar, swinging in the breeze. I closed it firmly and checked all the locks again. Nothing was missing, but the feeling of being watched was stronger now. I decided to stay inside most of the day. Around noon, I heard a noise outside like heavy footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Then a faint knocking on the door, 3 quick taps. I didn't open it. I stayed by the window, gripping the hatchet, watching the shadows between the trees. The knocking stopped. The footsteps moved away slowly. I didn't see anyone, but the fear had taken hold. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. The wind sounded like whispers through the trees. At one point, I thought I heard voices outside, low and muffled. But when I strained to listen, it was just the rustling leaves. On the 5th day, I knew I had to leave. The cabin didn't feel like a refuge anymore. It was a trap. I packed my things quickly, grabbing the essentials and the rest of the firewood. I kept the hatchet close and checked the windows and door one last time. I heard footsteps again, slow and steady, outside the cabin. When I stepped onto the porch, I saw footprints in the soft dirt. They were too big and deep for any animal. The prints circled the cabin, coming close to the door and then disappearing into the woods. I didn't wait. I ran down the dirt road, my boots kicking up dust. The trees blurred as I pushed myself harder, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, a paved highway that cut through the mountains. I flagged down the first car that passed, a man in a pickup truck who looked at me like I'd seen a ghost. When I told him about the cabin, the footprints, the knocking, he nodded grimly and said I wasn't the first to feel uneasy there. There were stories about a man who used to live deep in those woods, someone who didn't like visitors. Nobody had seen him in years, but apparently he still roamed the forest, watching. I didn't want to believe it, but after that trip, I never went back to the cabin or the woods around it. I kept thinking about those footsteps and the way the forest seemed to close in around me. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the scratching on the door, the footsteps in the dirt outside, and I wonder if maybe some places are better left alone. It was the autumn of 1997 when I decided to take a week off work and head to a small cabin tucked away in the dense woods of northern Vermont. I was 32 at the time, working a steady but draining office job in Boston. I'd never really been one for big cities or noise, and the idea of spending a week alone in the quiet woods was something I dreamed about for years. I found the cabin listed in a small magazine about remote places. It was owned by an old couple who only rented it out during the off-season when the leaves turned and the tourists had gone home. The cabin sat near a shallow river called Hollow Creek, surrounded by thick forest and nothing but miles of quiet wilderness. There was no cell phone signal and only a dirt road that led to it, the kind of place where the air felt heavier and time seemed to slow down. I packed up my old Subaru with all the essentials: a small stove, canned food, a heavy blanket, a first aid kit, and a few books. I didn't bring much technology, no laptop, no phone charger, just a camera and a flashlight. The plan was simple: to disconnect and spend my days walking the woods, reading by the fire, and sleeping under heavy quilts in the old cabin. The drive itself took almost 4 hours from Boston. I left early in the morning to avoid traffic, and as I neared Vermont, the city noise faded into rolling hills and forests coated in reds, yellows, and browns. The road became gravel, and I slowed down, trying to catch every detail of the forest that surrounded me. When I finally saw the cabin, it was even more secluded than I expected. A small wooden structure with peeling paint and a stone chimney, sitting next to the river, half hidden behind thick pine trees. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled of old wood, pine sap, and something faintly musty, like the memories of 1,000 autumns stored inside the walls. The cabin had one main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area with a rusty stove, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a narrow staircase that led upstairs to the bedroom. The floorboards were uneven, but solid, and the windows were thick and fogged with age. I unpacked my things slowly, letting the quiet settle around me like a blanket. There was no phone signal, no electricity other than the small solar lamp on the porch, and no neighbors for miles. The only sounds were the river's steady murmur and the wind moving through the trees. I found an old axe by the back door, likely left by the owners, and stacked some dry wood near the fireplace. That first night, I built a fire and sat on the wooden floor with a mug of hot tea, listening to the woods outside. The moon was bright, casting long shadows through the windows. The next day, I woke early to the sound of birds and the river rushing past. I ate canned peaches and dry bread for breakfast, then put on my hiking boots and walked along the creek. The forest was thick with oak and maple trees, their leaves rustling in soft gusts of wind. I walked for hours, following faint trails and sometimes slipping over mossy rocks. I took photos of the trees, the river, and small animals, squirrels, chipmunks, and once a deer drinking from the water's edge. The air smelled fresh and cold, carrying a hint of damp earth and pine needles. As the afternoon wore on, the sky grew cloudy, and I hurried back to the cabin to avoid rain. The dirt road leading back was slick with mud, and my boots left deep marks in the soft ground. Inside the cabin, I lit the fire again and sat near the hearth, reading an old book I'd brought, a novel about early settlers in New England. The warmth from the fire contrasted sharply with the coolness of the cabin's wooden walls, and I felt a strange mix of comfort and loneliness. That night, I went to bed early. The wind outside picked up, shaking the cabin gently, and the river sounded louder in the darkness. I pulled the blanket tight around me and tried to sleep, but something felt off, a restless tension I couldn't explain. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a quiet awareness that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just the isolation, that the woods were making me more sensitive. The next morning, the air was thick with fog, and the world outside looked ghostly in the gray light. I brewed coffee on the small stove and ate some canned beans while watching the river slowly appear through the mist. I decided to explore a little further today, packing a small backpack with water, snacks, my camera, and the axe just in case. The dirt road that led out of the cabin's clearing twisted through the trees, flanked by tall pines and thick underbrush. I walked carefully, noticing how the sounds of the forest changed. The usual birdsong was missing, replaced by the quiet hum of the wind and the crunch of leaves underfoot. About 2 miles from the cabin, I found an old logging path, barely visible under years of fallen leaves and small saplings. It looked like no one had been there for a long time. Curious, I followed it, pushing through branches and thorns. The path wound deeper into the woods, leading me to a clearing where an old, rusted pickup truck sat half buried in the earth. The windows were shattered, and the tires were flat. Nearby, there were faint signs of a campfire ringed with stones, cold and covered in ash. I took photos and studied the truck. It looked like it had been there for decades, abandoned and forgotten. But something about the place felt wrong. The silence was heavier here, like the forest was holding its breath. I decided to head back quickly, feeling the first twinge of unease in my stomach. Returning to the cabin, I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just an old junker in the woods and nothing more. But as dusk approached, that same uneasy feeling returned. I stayed close to the fire and kept my axe nearby, chopping more wood to keep the flames strong. The wind outside grew louder, howling through the trees and making the cabin creak and groan. Then, I noticed something I hadn't before: faint footsteps on the dirt road outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate, too heavy for an animal and too rhythmic. I froze, listening closely, but the sounds stopped suddenly, as if whoever made them had vanished. My heart pounded. I checked all the doors and windows, making sure they were locked. The cabin felt smaller, more confining. I sat with the axe resting against my legs and stared into the fire until it died down to glowing embers. That night, I barely slept. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of a leaf, made me jump. At one point, I thought I heard whispering carried on the wind, but I couldn't be sure. It was just the woods, I told myself again. Just the wind and the trees. The next morning was cold and clear. The sun shone through the window, lighting up the dust in the air. I was exhausted but determined to make the best of my time. I made breakfast and planned a longer hike downstream along Hollow Creek. I wanted to find out if there were any other cabins or signs of life nearby. I packed my bag with extra water and the axe, and headed out. The forest was alive with small movements. Birds, squirrels, the rustle of leaves. I stayed on the bank of the river, following its curve through the trees. After a few hours, I came to a fallen log that served as a bridge over a narrow part of the creek. The water was cold and clear, with smooth stones at the bottom. I stopped to rest, crouching by the water's edge, watching small fish dart beneath the surface. As I sat there, I noticed something strange downstream, a faint plume of smoke rising above the trees. I stood up quickly and looked harder. The smoke was thin and wispy, almost like a wisp of fog. It wasn't from the river or the trees, that much was clear. Someone else was in the woods. My mind raced. Why hadn't I heard or seen anyone before? The cabin was supposed to be remote, rented only by me this week. I debated whether to investigate or head back. The feeling of being watched returned, heavier this time. I knew the forest well enough to be cautious. I decided to follow the smoke, but from a safe distance. I stayed low and moved slowly through the underbrush, keeping the river to my right. The trees thickened, and the light dimmed under the canopy. The smoke grew stronger, and soon I saw a small clearing ahead. In the middle, someone had built a fire, fresh, still burning low. Around it were scattered supplies: a tarp, some food wrappers, and a plastic water bottle. No footprints led away from the fire, but the grass was flattened as if someone had been sitting there recently. The air smelled faintly of cigarettes and wood smoke. I felt a knot in my stomach. Someone had been here watching. Maybe they were still nearby. I didn't want to confront whoever it was, so I backed away quietly and returned the way I'd come. When I reached the cabin, I locked every door and window again and double-checked my supplies. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the trees. That night, I kept the fire roaring and the axe close. I stayed awake until the flames died down to embers, listening for any sound that didn't belong to the forest. I heard footsteps again, distant and slow. I peeked out the window but saw nothing. The cabin felt like a trap, isolated, defenseless. The next morning, I debated leaving. The uneasy feeling had grown into something deeper. I was 34 when I took a long weekend off and drove out to a small cabin I'd rented in the woods near Fort Bragg, California. It was September 2021. I remember because the leaves were just beginning to turn, but the air still felt warm enough in the daytime to be comfortable. I'd found the cabin through a private listing posted online. It wasn't on Airbnb or any major site. The man who owned it said it had once belonged to his grandfather and he hadn't gotten around to updating much. But he assured me it had water, power, and a working wood stove. That's all I really needed. I'd been working a remote IT job for a logistics company based out of Oregon, and I'd hit a wall with everything. My eyes hurt from staring at screens all day. My back was sore from sitting in the same chair. I felt disconnected, even though I was constantly surrounded by tech and people messaging me. So I decided to check out for a few days. No email, no calls, no deadlines, just trees, quiet, and time to reset. The drive up from Santa Rosa took about 3 hours, cutting through winding roads lined with thick pines and redwoods. By the time I got close, I'd already lost cell service. That was fine with me. I had preloaded the map and printed out directions, just in case. When I finally turned off the last paved road, I drove 5 more miles down a bumpy dirt trail that narrowed as I went. There were no signs, just trees and shadows. The cabin sat at the bottom of a small hill, tucked between tall pines. It looked like it hadn't been painted in decades. The siding was faded and weathered gray, and the roof sagged slightly. There was a small wooden deck on the front, a single door, and 2 windows on either side. Behind it, the woods thickened fast. You could walk 10 feet past the back of the cabin and be completely hidden by trees. I got out and stretched my legs. The air smelled like dry leaves and pine needles. Everything was quiet except for birds and the occasional creak of tree limbs swaying high up. There were no neighboring cabins or houses. Nothing. I liked that. Total privacy. I grabbed my duffel bag and cooler from the back of my truck and unlocked the front door using the code the owner had sent me. Inside, it was small, just a single room with a corner kitchen, a small table with 2 chairs, and a bed against the far wall. There was a fireplace on the opposite side and a narrow door that led to a bathroom with a shower and compost toilet. The windows were all sealed, and the place had a faint, earthy smell like dust and old wood, but it wasn't bad, just unused. I spent the first hour unpacking, setting my food in the mini fridge, and stacking the firewood neatly inside. I opened all the windows to get some air flowing. I walked the property a little, just checking out the area, noting the trails that looked like deer paths. There were a couple of rusted-out barrels behind the cabin and some ancient gardening tools leaned up against a stump. I didn't touch them. That evening, I cooked some simple pasta on the propane stove and ate while watching the sun go down through the trees. The light filtered through the branches in soft gold beams. The quiet was absolute. I didn't even realize how much background noise I was used to until it was gone. No traffic, no notifications, no voices through the wall. Just wind and birds and the occasional creaking pop of the old cabin settling. That night, I had trouble falling asleep, not because I was scared or anything, just because of how quiet it was. I lay in bed listening to the wind tapping against the windows, and every time the house groaned, I'd open my eyes. I guess I wasn't used to that kind of silence. At one point, maybe around 2 in the morning, I thought I heard what sounded like crunching leaves out back. Just once. Then nothing. Probably a raccoon or deer. I pulled the blanket tighter and tried to focus on breathing slowly until I finally passed out. The next morning, I woke up just after sunrise. I brewed coffee using a little metal percolator and sat on the front deck, watching the trees. A light mist had settled in the lower parts of the woods, curling between trunks like smoke. I felt better than I had in weeks. I was thinking about maybe making this a regular thing. Renting a remote place once every few months, disconnecting, clearing my head. Around midday, I decided to hike a little deeper into the woods behind the cabin. I brought a small backpack with water and some granola bars. I didn't plan to go far. I just wanted to explore a bit. The terrain was sloped and uneven. Moss-covered rocks and the forest floor was thick with fallen needles and branches. After maybe 20 minutes of slow walking, I came across what looked like the remains of an old fence. It was mostly collapsed, just some rotting posts and rusty wire twisted between them. Past the fence, I found a clearing with a large, dead tree in the center. It had been struck by lightning or cut down long ago, and the trunk had split open like a cracked bone. It looked almost fossilized. There were a few beer cans scattered around, old ones faded and crushed. Maybe someone used to hang out here. Or camp. I kept going for another few minutes, then turned back. I made sure to follow the same trail out, using landmarks I'd noted on the way in. But near that split tree, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small pile of stones near one of the larger roots, stacked almost carefully. At first, I thought maybe it was just a coincidence, but it didn't look natural. The rocks were too balanced. I didn't touch them. I just moved past and headed back toward the cabin. That night, the air felt different. The wind had died, and the forest was so still it felt unnatural, like it was holding its breath. I had made a fire in the fireplace and was reading a book I'd brought. I kept getting distracted by the feeling that something was just off. I couldn't explain it. No specific sounds or sights, just this tension I couldn't shake. Every now and then, I thought I heard a branch snap outside, but when I looked out the window, I couldn't see anything. Too dark. I went to bed around midnight, leaving the fire to burn down on its own. I locked the door and shut the windows, but I left the curtains open. I liked being able to see out. I don't know how long I lay there before I started hearing footsteps. Not animal movement, actual steps. Slow, steady. Leaves crunching softly. I froze. I didn't get up. I just lay there listening. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then stopped. I didn't hear them walk away. I waited. 10 minutes. Maybe 20. Nothing. I finally forced myself to get up. I didn't turn on any lights. I just stood at the window and tried to look out into the black. I couldn't see anything, but I had that feeling, the one where your body knows something's wrong before your brain does. My arms were covered in goosebumps. I checked the lock again and went back to bed, eyes wide open. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because I woke up to sunlight and birdsong. The fear I'd felt during the night seemed far away, like a dream. But when I stepped outside, there were footprints in the dirt by the deck. Not boot prints, bare feet. 2 of them, full adult size. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Who the hell walks around barefoot in the woods in the middle of the night? It hadn't rained, so they were clear and fresh, pressed deep into the soil. I didn't go hiking that day. I stayed close, double-checked all the windows and locks, and kept my knife in my pocket. I told myself maybe it was just a hiker, someone camping illegally nearby. But that didn't sit right. The prints circled the cabin. They'd stopped just under the window near my bed. I kept looking over my shoulder. Every sound made me jump. The peaceful vibe I'd felt the day before was gone, replaced by something much heavier. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept the lights on. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something scrape across the back wall of the cabin, long and slow. I grabbed my flashlight and sat in the chair by the door, just listening. I didn't go out there. I didn't want to. By sunrise, I'd made up my mind. I packed everything quickly, tossed it all in the back of the truck, and locked the cabin behind me. I didn't care that I had a day left on the rental. I didn't even leave a note. I just got in and started driving. I didn't stop until I hit the highway and saw a cell tower signal pop back onto my phone. I called a friend just to hear a voice. I didn't report anything. I didn't call the owner. I didn't even leave a review. I figured whatever or whoever that was, they'd be someone else's problem eventually. I just wanted to forget it. For weeks afterward, I kept checking the locks on my apartment twice, sometimes 3 times before bed. I bought blackout curtains. I started carrying a pocket knife even around town. It wasn't some ghost story. It wasn't monsters or demons. It was something worse, real people. That's what stuck with me the most. Someone had walked barefoot through the woods in the middle of the night, circled the cabin I was sleeping in, and stood outside my window watching me. And they didn't want anything. They didn't break in. They didn't try to talk. They just watched. That was enough. It was the fall of 1998 when I decided to spend a weekend alone at a small cabin I had rented deep in the woods of northern Vermont. I was 26 at the time, working as a graphic designer in Boston, needing a break from the noise and pressure of the city. The idea of escaping to the woods, away from phones and people, was exactly what I wanted. The cabin was nothing fancy. A simple wooden structure, with a small porch overlooking a dense forest and a creek that ran nearby. No electricity, no running water, just a propane stove and a wood fireplace. Perfect for disconnecting and recharging. I arrived late on a chilly Friday afternoon, the sky dull and heavy with gray clouds. The gravel road leading up to the cabin was narrow and winding, flanked by tall pines and oaks whose leaves had already turned golden and red. I had to be careful driving my old Subaru, but the quiet alone was worth the bumpy ride. I pulled up and got out, stretching my legs as the cold air hit my face. The smell of damp earth and pine needles filled my lungs. I carried my bags inside and shut the door behind me. The cabin was small but cozy. The living room had a rough stone fireplace, a couple of chairs, a rickety wooden table, and a bed against the far wall. A small kitchen area had a propane stove and a sink with a large jug of water I was supposed to carry in. There was a lantern on the table, along with some matches and a stack of firewood by the door. The windows looked out over the thick forest, where the trees swayed gently in the wind. The creek was just beyond the tree line, the sound of running water faint but calming. After setting my things down, I decided to make a fire. I stacked the wood carefully, struck a match, and soon the fireplace was crackling, the flames casting warm light around the room. Outside, the sky darkened quickly as the sun dipped below the trees. I ate a simple dinner, canned beans heated on the stove and a small loaf of bread, while watching the fire dance. The quiet was absolute, broken only by the occasional call of a distant bird or the rustling of leaves. I went to bed early that night, tired from the drive and the fresh air. The bed creaked beneath me as I lay down, pulling the thin blanket up to my chin. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the branches. I fell asleep to the sound of the fire sputtering and the occasional snap of a twig somewhere in the woods. Around midnight, I woke suddenly. The room was cold, the fire reduced to glowing embers. I reached for my lantern, lighting it carefully. The cabin felt different now, heavier, almost like the walls themselves were pressing in. I listened. There was a faint noise outside, something soft and irregular, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart beat faster. I told myself it was probably just a deer or a raccoon moving through the underbrush, but the sound didn't stop. Came closer, stopping near the cabin. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard the unmistakable scrape of something hard against wood. Slow, deliberate, like someone was trying to pry the cabin door open. Panic rose in my chest. I grabbed the old hunting knife I had brought, clutching it tightly. The noise stopped abruptly, and for a long moment there was silence, broken only by my ragged breathing. I stared out the window but saw nothing in the darkness beyond the faint glow of the lantern. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away, crunching on leaves, fading into the distance. I stayed awake the rest of the night, unable to sleep, listening to every sound, waiting for something to happen. The next morning, the wind had died down and the sun shone weakly through a thin layer of clouds. I went outside cautiously. Near the door, I saw scratches on the wooden frame, deep and rough, as if made by a knife or some kind of sharp tool. The bark of a nearby tree was also scraped in the same pattern. A chill ran through me. This wasn't just an animal. Someone had been here trying to get in. I searched around the cabin and found footprints in the soft earth. They were large and heavy, maybe a man's boots. They circled the cabin once before disappearing back into the woods. I felt exposed and vulnerable, alone with whoever had been lurking nearby. I debated leaving right then, but I hadn't planned this trip to be cut short by some unknown stranger. I told myself to stay calm and watch for signs, to keep the fire going at night and make noise if anything else happened. The rest of the day I gathered firewood, filled my water jug from the creek, and tried to enjoy the quiet again, but the feeling of being watched lingered. That night I was extra careful. I barricaded the door with a heavy chair, kept the fire blazing, and stayed alert. The noises returned, footsteps circling outside, whispers of movement through the leaves. I didn't hear words, but I could tell someone was out there, waiting. In the early hours of the morning, I heard a loud bang on the door. The chair I had placed fell over, and the door shook under the force of someone trying to break in. I scrambled to the window and peered out, but it was too dark to see clearly. Heart racing, I grabbed my knife and prepared for the worst. Then suddenly the banging stopped. The footsteps retreated, fading quickly into the woods. The silence returned. I stayed up until dawn, sitting near the fire, eyes fixed on the door. When morning came, I packed my things as fast as I could. I left the cabin without looking back and drove away as quickly as I could on the rough road. The police took my report seriously but said it was probably some local troublemakers or drifters passing through. Nothing more. They found no trace of anyone living nearby or any history of crime in that part of the woods. I never went back. Looking back, I realized how lucky I was that night. The experience changed how I saw the wilderness. Not just a peaceful retreat, but a place where danger could hide, even if it wasn't visible or explained by ghost stories or myths. Real danger was quiet, slow, and very real. Since then, I've stayed away from remote cabins alone. Sometimes I wonder who it was that tried to get in and why. Maybe they were just desperate, maybe dangerous. I'll never know. But I do know this. Sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts. They're people. And the woods don't always keep their secrets safe. I was 34 that summer when I rented the cabin in the northern part of Maine. It was about 20 miles from the nearest town, a quiet little place called Afton Ridge. I'd been working remotely for the last year and wanted somewhere I could shut out the noise, be by myself, maybe go on some hikes, and get away from how fast everything had started to feel. I wasn't running from anything dramatic, nothing like that. I just wanted space, peace, and the kind of quiet you can only really get deep in the woods. The place I found was an old one-room cabin, owned by a retired logger named Bill whom I'd found through a friend. He didn't use the cabin anymore and was happy to rent it to me for a few weeks. It was simple. One bed, a small wood stove, a sink that drained into a barrel, no plumbing, no cell service either. The only power came from a small gas generator I could run for a few hours at night if I wanted light or to charge something. There was an outhouse about 50 feet from the back door, hidden behind a few trees. It felt primitive, and that was exactly what I was looking for. The drive up there was long and bumpy. I had to take an unpaved road for the last few miles, and the final stretch was nothing more than a two-track trail. The trees leaned in close, branches brushing the sides of my car. When I finally parked in the small clearing, I just sat there for a minute with the engine off, listening. The forest didn't make the same kind of noise the city did. It had a rhythm. Sure birds, wind through the pines, the occasional creak of an old tree, but it wasn't constant. The silence had gaps in it, felt heavy in a good way. I spent the first day unpacking and settling in. The cabin had a musty smell at first, but I opened the windows and let the air move through. The floor was bare wood, old but solid. A few mouse droppings in the corners, but nothing serious. There were cobwebs in the rafters, but I left them alone. The bed was stiff, but the mattress was clean, and I'd brought my own sheets anyway. I stacked firewood inside near the stove and made a list of things I'd need to pick up the next time I drove to town. Extra water, more propane, maybe a few canned goods. That first night was colder than I expected. I got the stove going, but the heat didn't reach far. I had to wear a hoodie and wrap myself in my sleeping bag. I lay awake for a while, listening. When the fire went out, the sound of the forest filled the cabin again. Sometimes a branch would crack or a small animal would scurry past, and I'd freeze trying to figure out what it was. But it always passed. Eventually, I drifted off. Over the next few days, I settled into a rhythm. Mornings were cool and misty. I'd walk a little, make breakfast, and then sit outside with my coffee, just listening to the forest wake up. In the afternoons, I'd read or work on my laptop with the generator running, then cook a simple dinner, usually beans, rice, or pasta, and go to bed early. I saw a deer once, just at the edge of the clearing. It froze when it saw me, then turned and disappeared into the trees without a sound. That kind of thing made the whole trip feel worth it. The trouble didn't start right away. Crept in, small and easy to ignore. The first time I noticed something off was about a week in. I'd gone for a short hike along the old logging trail that started behind the cabin. I didn't go far, maybe 2 miles out and back. When I returned, the door to the cabin was cracked open. Just slightly. I was sure I'd closed it. I even remembered pulling it shut and turning the latch. I stood there for a minute, just staring at it. The forest was quiet, and nothing seemed out of place. I walked up slowly, listening, looking for signs of animals or maybe someone passing through. But nothing was disturbed. Inside, everything was as I left it. My gear, my food, even my phone charging on the little table next to the bed. I figured maybe I hadn't latched it all the way, and the wind had pushed it open. I told myself not to overthink it. Still, that night I couldn't sleep. Every sound felt closer. I kept imagining someone standing out there in the trees, just beyond the firelight. The next strange thing happened 3 days later. I'd gone into town to restock, spent a couple hours walking around Afton Ridge. It was the kind of place with one main street, a diner, and not much else. I liked that about it. When I got back, I found my water jug had been moved. I always kept it beside the wood stove, and I was sure I left it there that morning. Now it was by the front door, just sitting there like it had been placed there on purpose. I stood in the doorway for a while, staring at it. I checked everything. My backpack, my clothes, even the food shelves. Nothing else had been touched. I was starting to get this crawling feeling in my stomach, like I was missing something obvious. But there was no sign of forced entry. No footprints, no broken windows. I kept telling myself it had to be me. Maybe I'd moved it before leaving and forgot. Maybe I was getting too paranoid. But the feeling wouldn't go away. The turning point came 2 nights later. I was asleep when I heard something outside. It wasn't an animal. I knew that right away. It was footsteps. Not heavy, not rushing, slow, careful steps on the gravel outside the cabin. My eyes snapped open, and I stayed perfectly still. The fire had gone out, and the cabin was dark except for a bit of moonlight through the window. I held my breath and listened. The steps stopped just outside the front door. I couldn't see anything, but I knew someone was there. Then, just barely, I heard a creak, the sound of weight shifting on the porch. My heart was thudding so loud I thought whoever it was could probably hear it. I didn't move. After a while, the sound went away. No footsteps leaving. Just gone. The next morning, I found prints in the dirt.
Bootprints.
Not mine. They were larger and fresher than any of the old logging ones out on the trail. Whoever had been there had stood outside my cabin for a while, just watching. I felt something deep in my chest shift. Something I hadn't felt in years, real fear. Not movie fear, not roller coaster fear. The kind that makes your body go still and cold, like it's trying to disappear. I packed my gear and left that afternoon. I didn't say anything to Bill or the people in town. I just told myself I'd go home for a few days and come back when I felt better. But something about it wouldn't let go. Even in my apartment back in Boston, I couldn't sleep. I kept checking the locks, waking up in the middle of the night thinking I'd heard footsteps again. It didn't make sense. I didn't know what I was afraid of, not really. There had been no break-in, no confrontation, no crime. Just that slow, steady build-up of something being wrong. A week passed. Then 2. I thought about the cabin every day. I tried convincing myself to forget it, but I couldn't. Something had happened out there and I didn't understand it. That bothered me more than anything. So I went back. This time I didn't unpack. I brought a camera and set it up on a motion sensor outside the cabin. I placed trail markers leading out in different directions and checked them every few hours. I started keeping notes, logging every sound, every small change. I barely slept, drank too much coffee, and jumped at every noise. 2 nights in, I caught something on the camera. A man, mid-40s maybe, tall, beard, wearing an old jacket. He stood about 15 feet from the front porch for almost 10 minutes, staring at the cabin. He never moved, just stood there. The video ended before he left. I took the memory card into town the next morning and showed it to the sheriff. He watched it without saying much, just leaned back in his chair and stared at me afterward. He said it was probably a drifter or some hunter passing through. Told me if it happened again to come back and report it. That was it. Nothing more. I didn't go back after that. I told Bill he could keep the rest of the rental money. I didn't care. I packed everything into my car and drove all the way to my brother's place in New Hampshire that same day. I stayed with him for a week, then found another apartment closer to the city. I haven't been back to Maine since. Every now and then I still watch that video. Just once, never more than that. And every time, I remember the feeling I had that night, when I knew someone was just outside, standing in the dark, listening to me breathe. That feeling hasn't gone away, but at least now I understand it. It wasn't about ghosts or legends or anything made up. It was the simple, cold truth that sometimes people do things that don't make sense. They watch, they wait, and you don't always find out why. I stayed in a remote cabin in northern Vermont in the fall of 2019, after I'd taken a break from my job in Hartford. I was 34 at the time, feeling burnt out from long weeks of sales travel, and I'd started to get this urge to just disappear for a while. A friend of mine, Darren, who used to do Forest Service work, Told me about an old cabin near Peacham Lake that was still standing from when the state used it back in the 70s. It wasn't an official rental or anything. It was just there, empty on public land, no one guarding it, and it still had a working wood stove and bunk. He'd been there once while hiking and said it was perfect if I just wanted to be left alone. I had no reason not to trust him. So I packed up my stuff, some canned food, rice, a sleeping bag, a hatchet, a radio, and other basics, and drove about 4 hours up north. I left my car parked off an old dirt road, took a trail marker into the woods, and after about a 2-hour hike with a heavy backpack, I found the place. It looked like a forgotten ranger cabin, small, square, with a slanted roof and walls made from thick gray logs. The door creaked when I pushed it open, but the structure itself was solid. There was a narrow bunk nailed to one wall, a pot-bellied stove, and a little table with one chair. There was no insulation, no electricity, and the only light I had at night came from my headlamp and a few cheap lanterns. But it was quiet and clean enough, and it felt safe. The first 2 days were good. The weather was cool and cloudy. I spent time walking trails, reading old paperbacks I'd brought, boiling coffee on the stove, and writing thoughts down in a small notebook. I kept to myself, not because I was scared, but because that was the whole point of being there. No phone, no internet, just me and the trees and the sound of chipmunks running across leaves. On the third night, the wind picked up. Leaves hit the windows hard, and the trees outside groaned with each gust. I woke up around 1 a.m. to a scraping noise that I thought was just a branch brushing against the roof. Kept happening irregularly, like it was being dragged back and forth. I tried to ignore it, but it kept me up. In the morning, I went outside and checked the roof. Nothing up there. No branches long enough to reach that high. I shrugged it off. Maybe it had been something small up there, raccoon, maybe. Later that afternoon, I hiked to the edge of the lake. There wasn't a soul around. No boats. No cabins on the water. I stayed there for a while and returned to the cabin around 5, just as the sun began to sink behind the trees. When I got back, I noticed something strange. My sleeping bag was unzipped. I was sure I had left it zipped, rolled tight in a bundle. It wasn't laid out like someone had slept in it, just open. I told myself I probably just misremembered. Maybe I'd left it that way after airing it out. That night, around 11, I heard movement outside, crunching leaves. Not a deer, slower, steady, like a person walking. I sat up on the bunk and turned off my headlamp. The sound stopped. I waited in silence, listening. It was dead quiet for a few minutes. Then I heard something knock against the wall near the stove. Just one knock. Not a tap. More like a hard thud, like someone hit it with a fist or a rock. I grabbed my hatchet and stood near the door, barely breathing. I didn't go outside. I stood there for a long time, then eventually locked the door, if you can even call it that, a small bolt latch near the handle. After that, I laid back down with the hatchet resting across my chest and didn't sleep until it was nearly dawn. The next day was cold. I stayed close to the cabin, collected more firewood, tried not to think about the sound from the night before. I kept scanning the trees whenever I stepped outside. The forest had started to feel less peaceful and more like it was watching me. I didn't like that. Still, I didn't pack up. I told myself it was probably just a porcupine or a raccoon, maybe even a bear checking out the cabin. But there were no scratch marks, no broken wood, no tracks in the dirt, just quiet. On the 5th day, I noticed something missing. A small camping knife I kept on the table. It wasn't there. I looked through my bag, through the little drawer near the bunk, even outside where I chopped wood, but it was gone. It wasn't an expensive knife, but I knew I hadn't lost it. I always kept it in the same place. That made my stomach turn. The idea of someone walking in while I was out, going through my stuff, it didn't feel like an animal anymore. It felt personal. That night, I locked the door again and wedged a chair under the handle. I didn't have a gun, just the hatchet and the folding saw. I kept both beside the bunk and slept in my clothes. I barely slept. Around 2 a.m., I heard movement again. Soft footsteps, leaves shifting outside. Then silence. Then a faint creak, like pressure on the porch boards. I held my breath. I swear I could hear breathing outside the door. Then, Nothing. It stayed quiet for the rest of the night. In the morning, I checked everything. No footprints. No signs of forced entry. But the can of beans I'd left near the stove was gone. I hadn't eaten it. I hadn't moved it. I checked everywhere, thinking maybe I misplaced it. I hadn't. That was the moment when I knew, without a doubt, someone had been coming in while I was out or asleep. I started carrying the hatchet with me even during the day. I felt watched. I kept looking over my shoulder when I hiked to the lake or into the woods. That day, I found something else that didn't belong. A piece of twine tied around a branch at eye level, maybe 20 yards from the cabin. It looked fresh, bright blue, not weathered like the rest of the forest. I hadn't put it there. It didn't mark a trail. It didn't lead anywhere. That night, I built a fire outside and stayed up late beside it, hoping the light would keep whatever or whoever was nearby away. Around midnight, the fire burned low, and I was just about to head inside when I heard a sound deeper in the woods. A high-pitched whistle. One note, then silence. Then again. Same tone. It didn't sound like an owl. It didn't sound natural. I didn't respond. I grabbed my bag, my light, and the hatchet, and I went inside, bolting the door. I didn't sleep. The whistling never came closer, but it happened twice more before sunrise. By then, I'd had enough. I packed up as quickly as I could, skipped breakfast, and started hiking out around 7 a.m. I didn't look back at the cabin. I stayed alert, checking behind me every couple of minutes. I thought I was alone, but about halfway back to my car, I found something on the trail. My missing camping knife. It was stabbed into the middle of the path, stuck in the dirt upright, just standing there like someone had placed it for me to find. I stood frozen for a minute, staring at it. I didn't touch it. I walked around it and kept moving, faster now, heart pounding, listening for any noise in the woods around me. When I reached the dirt road, my car was where I left it. I unlocked it, threw my pack in, and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop driving until I hit Montpelier. I pulled into a gas station, sat in the car with the engine off and tried to calm down. My hands were shaking. I never called the police. I didn't have any proof. Nothing was stolen beyond food. I hadn't seen a face, hadn't been attacked. I just knew I was being watched, and someone had been inside that cabin with me, or when I wasn't there. I told Darren what happened weeks later. He didn't say much, just that he'd never go back there. I still think about it sometimes. I don't go camping alone anymore. I haven't been back to Vermont. That trip was supposed to give me peace, a break from people. Instead, it reminded me that the scariest thing out in the woods isn't some wild animal or ghost story. It's someone watching from the trees, someone who doesn't want to be seen, someone who doesn't say a word, just waits, and lets you know in the smallest ways that you're not as alone as you think. It was October 2021 when I decided I needed a break from the city. I was 32, living in a small apartment in Columbus, Ohio, and working from home for a finance company. The job wasn't bad, but the daily noise, traffic, and isolation had worn me down. I had gone 2 full years without a proper vacation, and I could feel it in my bones. So when my manager approved a week off, I booked a remote cabin in northern Michigan. I didn't want beaches, cities, or amusement parks. I wanted quiet, just a forest, a lake nearby, and some time to clear my head. The place I found was about an hour outside of Marquette, tucked away near a narrow gravel road that barely showed up on Google Maps. The listing was simple: a small log cabin with solar power, a fireplace, and a hand pump well. No cell service, no internet, no neighbors for miles. That's exactly what I wanted. I booked it for 7 days and packed up my SUV with a cooler full of food, a pile of paperbacks, and my old fishing gear. I figured I'd read, fish, and sleep, no distractions, no obligations. The drive up was peaceful. I took it slow, stopping for gas and snacks along the way. The farther north I went, the more the scenery changed. The trees were taller, the air was cooler, and everything smelled like pine. I turned off the main highway just past a small town called Bergen and drove down a long stretch of unmarked road. The gravel kicked up behind me in thick plumes, and the only sounds were the tires crunching and the wind through the trees. I reached the cabin just after 4 p.m. The place was smaller than I imagined, just one story with a sloped green roof and a tiny porch out front. It looked solid though, built from real logs, not one of those prefab ones. The yard was overgrown with tall grass and wildflowers, and a rusted metal fire pit sat off to one side. Behind the cabin, the forest thickened quickly, and I could just make out a faint trail leading deeper into the trees. A faded wooden sign nailed to a post read North Trail, but there weren't any markers after that. The key had been left in a lockbox under the porch, and everything inside was as expected, Spartan but clean. A small bed, a table with 2 chairs, a cast iron stove, and a bookshelf with a few worn-out novels. The fridge ran off solar and was humming softly. I unloaded my stuff, put the perishables away, and lit a fire in the stove. The cabin creaked in the wind like any old structure does, but it felt sturdy enough. I settled in quickly, cooking some sausage and eggs for dinner and drinking a few beers I'd packed. As the sun set, the trees outside turned black, and the only light came from the fireplace and my flashlight. It was quiet in a way that made your ears ring. No traffic, no people, no anything. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The bed was old but surprisingly comfortable, and the blanket was heavy and warm. I kept a lantern nearby but didn't need it. The darkness was complete, but not frightening. In the distance, I heard a few animal sounds. Something scurrying across the roof, maybe a raccoon, but nothing unusual. The next morning, I woke up around 7 a.m. and made coffee on the stove. I sat out on the porch and watched the forest slowly come to life. Birds chirped, leaves rustled in the breeze, and I felt this deep calm settle over me. Around noon, I grabbed my fishing pole and hiked down to a small lake about a mile away. The trail was narrow and uneven, but it was clear enough to follow. I spent the afternoon fishing from the shore, catching and releasing a few small perch. It wasn't about the fish, it was about the stillness. I didn't see another person all day. When I got back to the cabin, I was tired but relaxed. I made pasta for dinner, read a few chapters of an old novel, and went to bed early. The third day, I decided to explore the trail behind the cabin. I packed a small backpack with water, jerky, and my compass. The trail started clearly enough, but within 20 minutes, it narrowed and the trees thickened. I followed it carefully, checking my direction every so often. The forest was denser than I expected, and the further I went, the quieter it got. I didn't hear birds anymore. Even the wind seemed to die down. Felt like walking into a bubble. I was about an hour in when I noticed something odd. A piece of blue tarp caught high in a tree. It was tangled in the branches about 10 feet up, and it looked like it had been there a while. Torn and faded. Beneath it, there was a flattened area of grass and a few rusted cans scattered around. Like someone had camped there maybe months or even years ago. I checked around a bit more but didn't find anything else. No bags, no fire pit, nothing. Just that strange tarp and the feeling that someone had been there long ago. I turned back. It was still early, but something about that spot made me uneasy. I made it back to the cabin just after 2 p.m. and spent the rest of the day inside, chopping wood and reorganizing the supplies I'd brought. I wasn't scared, but there was this new weight in the air, something I couldn't name. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about that campsite, how it didn't seem abandoned so much as left behind quickly. On the 4th night, I woke up around 3 a.m. I wasn't sure why at first. The fire had died out, and the room was freezing. I got up to throw more wood in the stove, but then I heard it, a crunch outside, like a footstep on gravel. I stood completely still. The cabin has no neighbors, no nearby roads, and I hadn't seen a soul in days. I slowly stepped to the window and looked out. The yard was pitch black. I turned off my flashlight so I wouldn't make myself visible. I waited. Nothing. Just the creak of trees in the breeze. After 10 minutes, I gave up, convinced it had just been a branch falling or an animal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The rest of the night, I barely slept. I kept thinking of that tarp in the tree, of how quiet the forest had been. The next morning, I checked the yard carefully. There were no footprints, but the grass was disturbed near the fire pit, flattened in a wide circular patch. I told myself it was probably a deer, but it looked wider than that. I didn't fish that day. I didn't hike. I stayed inside, reading and trying to ignore the feeling that something was off. That evening, I made dinner early and locked up tight. I barred the door, closed the shutters, and kept the fireplace low. Around 10 p.m., I turned off the lights completely and just sat in the dark. I don't know why, I just felt like I needed to listen. Around midnight, I heard it again. The same crunching sound. Slow and heavy. Not an animal. Something moving in a circle around the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I sat there, holding my breath, waiting for it to pass. It stopped near the window for a long time. Then nothing. I waited another hour before moving. When I finally went to the window, there was nothing there. The next morning, I found something new. On the side of the cabin, someone had carved a mark into the wood. 3 straight lines about 6 inches long, perfectly even. I hadn't noticed them before, and they weren't there when I arrived. That was the moment I decided to leave. I packed everything in less than an hour. I didn't eat, didn't make coffee, just loaded up the SUV and left. As I backed out of the yard, I checked the side mirror. For a second, I thought I saw someone standing at the edge of the trees, but when I looked again, the space was empty. I drove straight back to Columbus that day, stopping only for gas. I never told anyone the full story. I didn't want people thinking I'd imagined it or that I was paranoid. But I know what I heard. I know those marks weren't there before. And I know something or someone was out there with me. A few weeks later, I looked up the area near Bergen, Michigan. I found an old newspaper article about a missing person from 2014. A guy in his 40s who went out to stay in a hunting cabin and never came back. They found his truck, but not him. The article had a photo of the trail marker, North Trail, same as the one behind my cabin. I haven't been camping since. I still think about going back sometimes just to see. But the truth is, I don't think I was supposed to be there. I think someone else still is. I was 31 when I decided to spend a week alone in a cabin in northern Minnesota. It was September 2022. I had just come out of a long, draining breakup and needed space. I didn't want to stay at home where everything reminded me of her. I had no interest in talking to friends or pretending to be okay. I wanted isolation, quiet, and just something that felt like control. I booked a cabin I found online, one of those small private ones near Lake Iskatika, about an hour past the last real town if you took Route 47 and then a dirt road for 6 miles. It looked peaceful in the pictures. One room, wood-paneled walls, a wood-burning stove, a small deck, and nothing but woods around it. The kind of place where you'd hear the wind and maybe some loons on the lake in the distance. No one else around. That's what I wanted. The drive took about 5 hours from my apartment in St. Paul. It was long and uneventful, mostly flat land and stretches of tall pine. I stopped at a grocery store in a small town called Bertram and picked up enough food for the week: frozen meals, canned goods, a few snacks, bottled water, and instant coffee. I also got a spare gas can, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. I'd grown up around the outdoors and wasn't completely clueless, but I wasn't exactly a survival expert either. Still, I liked to think I could handle myself for a week alone in a cabin. When I arrived, the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees. The dirt road had gotten narrower and rougher the closer I got. There were no signs or driveways, just my phone GPS, which had stopped updating about 15 minutes before I got to the cabin. I recognized it from the photos. It was smaller than I expected, with a mossy green roof and some rot around the bottom edges of the exterior siding, but it looked solid enough. There was a padlock on the door like the listing had said, and the key was exactly where it was supposed to be, in a metal box nailed behind the wooden post by the stairs. Inside, it smelled of dust and old wood. The cabin was one open room with a small kitchenette in the corner, a twin bed by the window, a small table with 2 chairs, and a narrow wood stove. There was a short hall that led to the bathroom, just a toilet and a sink with cold running water. The air was cool and damp, and everything felt like it hadn't been used in a long time. I unpacked my bag, lit a couple of candles from the shelf, and sat on the steps out front eating a sandwich while the trees turned black against the sky. No cars, no voices, no movement except for a few birds rustling in the branches. Felt good. The first day was uneventful. I woke up early, made coffee on a little portable burner I brought, and spent the morning walking the woods behind the cabin. I didn't follow any trails. There weren't any marked, but the trees weren't so dense that it was hard to move around. I kept my bearings by tracking the sun and occasionally looking back to remember the way. The woods were thick with pine and birch, and the ground was soft with needles and moss. I saw deer tracks, squirrels, and even heard what I thought was a fox barking once. It was peaceful, quiet enough that you could hear leaves settle when the wind stopped. I spent the afternoon reading an old paperback I'd brought and took a short nap before dinner. I didn't bother locking the cabin. I had the only key, and it was so remote I figured there was no need. That night, I lit a fire in the stove mostly for comfort. It wasn't cold enough to need it, but I liked the glow. I sat on the floor watching the flames and fell asleep early. The next morning, I noticed something strange. When I went outside, I saw boot prints in the dirt near the cabin. At first, I thought they were mine, but they were larger and deeper than the hiking boots I wore. These looked more like work boots. I looked around, thinking maybe a hunter had wandered by, but it was private property, and the tracks weren't just passing by, they circled the cabin. Not a perfect circle, but they stopped near the back window and again by the sidewall under the bathroom window. That unsettled me. I hadn't heard anything during the night, and I slept pretty lightly. I checked the door and windows. Nothing was broken or moved. Still, it made me uneasy. I brushed it off. Maybe the owner had come by to check on the place. Maybe someone was lost. I tried to think of normal explanations. I spent that day fishing at the edge of the lake, which was about a 10-minute walk down a small slope behind the trees. I didn't catch anything. I barely cared. The water was still and dark, and I sat on a rock for hours just listening to it lap against the shore. But I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. Every little crack in the woods made me turn my head. I had this low, constant feeling that someone was nearby. Couldn't shake it. That night, I locked the cabin door. I hadn't planned to, but I did it without even thinking. I kept the flashlight close and didn't light a fire in the stove. I lay awake for a long time listening. At some point, I drifted off. Around maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. I didn't hear anything, but I had the feeling again. That tight pressure in the chest, like someone was standing just outside the door. I sat up slowly and stayed still for a while. No footsteps, no breathing, just the normal creaks of the old cabin and the breeze outside. Eventually I fell asleep again, but it wasn't restful. The next day, things escalated. I went outside and found a small piece of metal on the step. It was a rusted nail, not bent or broken, just sitting there like it had been placed. I looked up and down the railing. Nothing seemed loose. I walked around the cabin again. This time I saw more boot prints, fresher, closer to the windows than before. I noticed a small scratch on the back window pane. Just one thin line, not wide or deep, but it hadn't been there before. That's when I started to get paranoid. I took a kitchen knife and put it next to the bed. I also brought in a heavy branch I'd found in the woods and leaned it near the door. I felt ridiculous, but I also knew something wasn't right. I decided not to stay outside long that day. I kept the door locked and tried to read, but my eyes kept flicking to the windows. Every little creak in the wood or gust of wind made me jump. I ate cold canned beans and crackers for dinner because I didn't want to make noise heating anything. That night, I pushed the small dresser in front of the door. It was flimsy, but it gave me some sense of control. I kept my flashlight in one hand and the knife in the other as I lay on the bed in the dark. Sometime after midnight, I heard the sound of gravel being stepped on. Not loud, not close, just a faint crunch, like someone slowly moving through the dirt outside. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I lay there staring at the ceiling, heart pounding. The noise stopped after a few seconds. Then nothing. I waited and waited, but I couldn't bring myself to look out the window. I was too scared of what I'd see. I stayed like that until morning. By the time the sun came up, I'd made up my mind to leave. I packed everything as fast as I could and loaded it into the car. I did one last walk around the cabin. When I got to the backside, my stomach dropped. There were scratches on the siding. Not deep gouges, just narrow, straight marks, about 6 inches long, lined up in a row near the window, like someone had run a tool or a knife along the wall. I didn't take pictures. I didn't want to remember it. The drive out was tense. I kept looking in the mirror. Every bump in the dirt road made me jump. When I finally got to pavement, I pulled over and sat in the car for 10 minutes, just breathing. I thought about calling the sheriff's office, but what would I say? That someone walked around a cabin and maybe scratched a window? There was no crime, no proof. I didn't want to deal with it. I just drove home. I never found out who it was. Maybe it was some drifter. Maybe a hunter who didn't like people in his area. Maybe someone who knew the cabin was remote and liked to scare people. I changed my number a month later when I got a call from an unknown number with no message. Could have been anyone. Probably nothing. But I didn't want to risk it. Since then, I haven't gone back to the woods alone. I still think about it sometimes when it's quiet at night and I can't sleep. I remember the sound of those steps outside and the way the air felt, like someone was watching. I remind myself it ended okay. I got out. Nothing happened. But it's not something I'll ever forget. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you see. It's knowing someone was out there, close, quiet, and patient, and you'll never know why. I was 36 the year I decided to rent out a remote cabin in northern Minnesota. It was late October, 2019, right before the snow started to settle in for good. The place was called Crescent Rock, just a tiny dot near the edge of Lake Marnell, way up near the border with Canada. I'd found the listing on an old travel forum. Some guy had posted a thread years ago about how peaceful it was, and after digging around online, I found a property management website that still listed it for rent. It was cheap too. Too cheap, really. That should have made me pause, but I was looking for somewhere quiet. I'd burned out pretty bad working in the city. My job was remote by then, and I figured if I brought my laptop and hotspot, I could still handle a few things while getting a break from the noise. I drove up alone in my beat-up SUV, loaded with a week's worth of groceries, a few boxes of supplies, and some old winter gear I hadn't used in years. The road started paved but turned to gravel about 20 miles from the cabin. It wasn't much, just 2 tire tracks running through thick, leafless woods. The drive-in took another 45 minutes, winding past patches of birch and pine. It was the kind of place where cell service dropped fast, and you couldn't see more than 20 feet into the trees. I passed 2 old signs on the way in, both rusted to hell, one of them half knocked over. There were no other cabins in sight, no signs of life at all. When I finally pulled up to the place, it was late afternoon. The cabin looked smaller than the pictures made it seem. 1 story, faded wood siding, a metal chimney, and a wraparound porch that leaned a little to one side. A narrow path led down to the lake, but I couldn't see much of the water from the front. There was a small shed out back, padlocked, and a pile of firewood stacked against the far wall. No lights, no noise, no neighbors. Just woods and the sound of wind slipping through branches. Inside, the place was dusty but not dirty. 1 main room with a couch, a stone fireplace, and a table by the window. The kitchen was a narrow strip off to the side, with a working fridge, an old gas stove, and some mismatched cabinets. There were pots and pans hanging above the counter, and a bunch of canned food left behind on one shelf. I took a mental note of that. It felt odd, but maybe the last guest left them. The bedroom had a queen mattress on a metal frame and a closet with some old jackets hanging inside. No TV. No radio. Just a landline on the wall, probably dead. That first night, I unpacked, made some pasta, and sat by the fireplace with a book I never ended up reading. The fire crackled. The wind picked up a little, and I remember thinking how good it felt to be away from the city. Just silence and space. I slept hard that night. No noise, no lights, just a cold room and the sound of the wind tapping against the cabin walls. The next morning, I woke up early. I went out to the lake with a thermos of coffee and stood by the water. It was completely still. Not a single ripple. A light mist rolled along the surface, and I could see the tree line on the other side stretching out in every direction. There wasn't a dock, just a patch of worn grass and rocks. I stayed there a while, breathing in the cold air, sipping coffee, not really thinking about anything. That afternoon, I walked the woods behind the cabin. There were no trails, just thick undergrowth and scattered branches. I didn't go far, maybe half a mile, before I turned back. The trees were tight together, and the light didn't cut through very well. Everything felt a little off in there. I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see something, but there was nothing, just trees and the soft crunch of old leaves underfoot. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something that hadn't caught my eye before. A fresh footprint in the dirt near the shed, bigger than mine, pointed toward the forest. Could have been mine, I told myself. Maybe from earlier, but I couldn't remember walking that close to the shed. I brushed it off, went inside, and cooked dinner. That night, I kept the fire going longer and listened to the wind. Felt louder. At some point, I heard a sharp knock outside, like something hard had struck the side of the cabin. I froze, waited. Then it happened again. Just once. I got up slowly, walked to the window, and looked out. Nothing. The woods were pitch black. I stayed near the fire for another hour, poking at the logs, before finally heading to bed with the fire still burning low. Around 3 a.m., I woke up needing the bathroom. The air in the bedroom felt colder than it had the night before. The floorboards creaked loud under my feet as I crossed the room. When I got to the bathroom, I noticed something else. The front door latch was undone, just hanging there. I stared at it for a long time. I knew I'd locked it. I always did. I shut it tight and slid the deadbolt, then stood there listening. The woods outside were silent, completely still. No wind, no animals, no sound. The next morning, I checked the door again. Still locked, but I couldn't shake that feeling. I skipped my usual walk and instead stayed near the cabin, cleaning up the kitchen and sorting through the firewood. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, but it was just me. At one point, I went out back and took another look at the footprint by the shed. It was still there. No new prints. But now the padlock on the shed looked different. Scratched, like someone had taken a tool to it. The metal was worn in one spot, like it had been twisted or bent. I didn't open it. Something about that felt like a bad idea. Instead, I went back inside, took a long shower, and turned on my laptop to try and get some work done. No internet. The hotspot wouldn't connect. I rebooted it twice, then gave up. The landline still didn't work either. I hadn't thought to bring a signal booster. I guess I figured it would be fine. That night, I didn't light the fire. I wanted to hear better. I sat on the couch, lights off, just listening. At around 10, I heard something. Not wind, not an animal. A slow shuffle on the porch, then the sound of weight shifting on old wood. Someone was standing out there. I sat frozen, staring at the front door. The footsteps moved, soft and heavy, around to the side. I couldn't see anything from the windows. Then it was quiet. I stayed up until dawn, sitting with my back against the wall, holding the fireplace poker like an idiot. Nothing else happened. Just silence. The next morning, I packed my things. I didn't care how early it was. I didn't care how much I'd paid. I loaded everything into the SUV as fast as I could. When I went to start the engine, nothing happened. The battery was dead. No sound. No click. I tried the lights. Nothing. It had been working fine all week. I opened the hood and stared at the engine like I had any idea what to look for. The battery cables were still connected. No corrosion. But there was a smell, like burned rubber or plastic. Something wasn't right. I went back inside and locked the door. Sat there trying to think. I was 2 hours from any town. No cell signal. No working phone. The only road out was the way I came in, and I didn't feel safe walking it. I didn't know if someone was out there watching. I didn't know how far I'd get. The woods weren't empty. That much I was sure of. That night, I barely slept. I pushed the couch in front of the door, moved the kitchen table to block the back entrance, and kept a knife on me. I sat in the corner of the bedroom with my back against the wall, staring at the window. Just before dawn, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, measured, right outside. Then something brushed the window. Not a knock, not a tap, just a soft drag, like fingertips sliding across the glass. Then silence. I don't know how long I sat there after that. Probably hours. When the sun came up, I forced myself to move. I went out again to the SUV. Still dead. I opened the back and started pulling gear, warm clothes, flashlight, water, whatever I could carry. I left a note inside the cabin, just in case. Scribbled where I was heading and when I left. I didn't know if anyone would ever read it, but it felt right. I started walking down the road around 9 a.m. The woods were quiet again. Too quiet. Every few minutes I stopped to listen. No birds, no wind, just my own footsteps. I kept thinking I'd hear something behind me. Once I did. A soft crack. I turned fast, but saw nothing. I picked up the pace. Took me nearly 5 hours to reach the nearest house. An old farm with a wide clearing and 2 trucks out front. The woman who answered the door looked at me like I'd crawled out of a ditch. She didn't ask questions, just called someone to pick me up. I reported what happened, gave them the address. They sent a deputy out there later that week. He called me after, told me the place was empty. No signs of forced entry. The SUV had a cut battery cable. The shed had been broken into, but nothing was taken. Just some old tools inside. They didn't find anyone. No tracks, no evidence. Just a few scratches on the windows and 1 clear handprint on the glass. Bigger than mine. I was 38 when I decided to take a break from everything. That year, 2021, had been a mess. Between long hours at the construction site, my shoulder injury, and the whole thing falling apart with my ex, I was running on fumes. I needed to disappear for a while, somewhere quiet, somewhere that didn't smell like concrete dust and sweat. So I rented a cabin through a small site I found online. It wasn't on Airbnb or anything like that. Just a plain HTML page that looked like it hadn't been updated since 2004. But the photos looked decent enough. A small wooden cabin in northern Vermont, about 20 minutes from a town called Belford. No neighbors, no service, no Wi-Fi. It was exactly what I needed. I took my old black Ford Ranger and drove up from central Connecticut, the bed stuffed with supplies. Mostly dry food, water, tools, and a couple jugs of gas. I brought my .22 rifle too, not because I planned to hunt, but because I always kept it close whenever I stayed somewhere remote. There were bears in Vermont and plenty of other things that could go wrong. I got there just past noon on a Tuesday in late September. The dirt road that led to the cabin was narrow and winding, with trees thick on both sides. I kept the windows rolled down for fresh air, and the smell of pine mixed with that earthy smell you only get in the woods. After about a mile of bouncing over rocks and potholes, I saw the clearing open up ahead. The cabin was exactly like the photos. Small, 1-story, cedar siding darkened by age, green moss creeping up from the base. There was a little porch with a broken rocking chair and some stacked firewood next to the door. No one else was around, not even a bird chirping, just dead quiet except for the wind in the trees. I parked the truck beside the porch and stepped out. I stood there a while, just breathing it in, letting the quiet settle into my chest. Felt good. Heavy but good. Inside, the cabin was rustic but functional. The kitchen was tiny, just a sink, a propane stove, and a mini fridge that only worked if the generator was running. There was a small table, 2 wooden chairs, and an old stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A narrow hallway led to a bathroom and a single bedroom. The bedroom had a cot-style bed, a metal frame lamp, and a dresser that smelled like mothballs when I opened the drawers. Everything creaked, the floor, the doors, even the air felt like it creaked. I spent the first day unpacking, making the place livable. I filled a couple 5-gallon buckets with water from the nearby stream, just to have some backup. The generator sat in a shed behind the cabin, and after a few pulls on the cord, it coughed to life. I didn't want to waste gas, so I planned to use it sparingly, just for cooking and the fridge when needed. I had 2 coolers packed with ice for most of my food anyway. That night, I sat on the porch with a beer, wrapped in a flannel blanket, and just watched the trees sway. The stars were clear, no city light in sight. I slept better than I had in months. The second day was mostly uneventful. I hiked around the woods a little, just exploring. There were no marked trails, but I stuck to compass bearings and made sure I could always trace my way back. I came across an old hunting stand in a clearing about half a mile out. Looked like it hadn't been used in years. Birds had nested inside it. I made note of it and kept moving. That afternoon, I chopped some firewood, organized my supplies, and wrote in a journal I brought along. That night, I sat by the fire I built outside and listened to the forest. A few branches cracked now and then, but that's just the woods. Trees settling, animals moving through brush. Normal stuff, but things started to feel off on the third night. I'd gone to bed around 10, curled up in my sleeping bag with the windows slightly cracked. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to the sound of what I thought was footsteps. Slow, careful ones. I stayed still, eyes wide open in the dark. My mind immediately tried to rationalize it, deer maybe or some other animal. But I couldn't shake how heavy the steps sounded. Like boots, not hooves. They didn't last long. Maybe 10 seconds. Then nothing. I stayed frozen for a while before I got up and quietly grabbed the rifle from the corner. I stood there in the dark, listening. Eventually, I sat down on the edge of the bed, rifle across my lap, and waited. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I walked the perimeter. Didn't see anything out of the ordinary. No footprints, no broken branches, no signs of anything moving through. I told myself it was my imagination, that maybe I just heard a branch fall or an animal that sounded heavier than it was. I spent the rest of the day distracted. I tried fishing in the stream but didn't catch anything. The air felt colder. I double-checked that the cabin doors and windows locked. That night, I brought the rifle into bed again, just in case. On the 5th morning, I found something strange. Right at the edge of the clearing, near where the tree line started, there was a fresh cigarette butt, still a little damp. I hadn't smoked in years. I don't let people smoke in my truck. There was no trash around it, no footprints, no crushed grass. Just that single cigarette like it had been dropped there carefully. I picked it up with a paper towel, brought it inside, and set it on a napkin near the sink. My hands shook a little, but I tried not to let it get to me. The generator had burned more gas than I expected, so I decided to cut back even more. That night, I didn't turn it on at all. I made a cold dinner, crackers, jerky, a little cheese, and sat in the dark with just a lantern and the rifle across the table from me. Around 1 a.m., I heard footsteps again, this time on the porch. Slow, measured, maybe 4 or 5 steps. Couldn't breathe. I turned off the lantern and just listened. No knocking, no voice, just those few steps and then silence. I sat there until the sun came up. In the morning, I found nothing. No prints, no scuff marks on the wood. The rocking chair hadn't moved. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. I just knew. I packed most of my gear into the truck that day, left only a few essentials in the cabin. I planned to leave early the next morning, even though I still had a few days left on the rental. I wasn't going to stay another night, but I did, because that afternoon my truck wouldn't start. Battery was dead. I checked everything I could. Connections, fuses, corrosion, but nothing worked. I tried jump-starting it using the generator, but it wasn't strong enough. I didn't have cell service, and the nearest road was miles away through thick woods. I was stuck, at least for another day. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed by the window, lights off, rifle in my lap. Around 3 a.m., I saw movement near the tree line. Just a flash, a shape, too quick to make out, but it was there. I watched the tree line for over an hour. Nothing moved again. But when the sun came up, I found another cigarette butt. This one was closer to the cabin. No ash, no burn marks on the grass. Like it had been placed there, not dropped. That morning, I packed everything I could carry into my backpack, including the rifle, and started walking. I left a note inside the cabin with the date and time, just in case. I marked the direction back to the main road using ribbons from my first aid kit. It took over 6 hours to reach the highway, and when I did, I flagged down a trucker who let me ride in the bed back to Belford. From there, I got help. A few days later, I went back with a tow truck and a sheriff's deputy. My truck was exactly where I left it, cabin untouched, but the sheriff found footprints in the dirt behind the shed. Deep ones, like someone had stood there watching the back of the cabin for a long time. There were cigarette butts scattered around that area too. At least 10 of them. No one could say how long they'd been there. They never found who it was. The rental owner said only one person had access to the property, and it wasn't him. I never got answers, but I haven't gone back into the woods alone since. I still have that cigarette butt, the first one I found. I keep it in a plastic bag in a drawer. A reminder, not of fear, but of caution. Because it wasn't the forest that made me leave that cabin. It was the feeling that someone else had chosen not to. It was late September 2013 when I decided to spend a long weekend alone in the mountains of northern Vermont. I had just turned 34 a few months earlier, and work had been eating me alive ever since the company merger in spring. I was behind on sleep, stuck in a loop of phone calls, meetings, emails, and then more emails. I wanted to disconnect for a while, and the idea of doing nothing for 3 or 4 days somewhere quiet seemed like the only way I'd survive the rest of the year. I didn't want to fly anywhere. I just needed quiet, trees, fresh air, and a place where my phone wouldn't buzz every 10 minutes. I found a rental cabin on a private piece of land near a lake about 20 miles from Montpelier. It looked old but solid. No Wi-Fi, no cable, just a fireplace and a view of the trees. That was all I wanted. I got there around noon on a Thursday. The drive from Albany had taken longer than I expected, mostly because I stopped for groceries and filled up my tank in town before heading up the final 12 miles of unpaved road. The trees had started to change color, but the air was still warm, especially for that far north. The directions said to drive until I passed a rusted metal gate on the left, then take the narrow dirt path for about a quarter mile. I followed the instructions, and eventually the road opened up to a small clearing with a single-story wooden cabin sitting in the middle of it. It looked exactly like the photos. Weathered dark brown siding, green shutters, a small porch with a bench, and a woodpile stacked neatly along one wall. It felt remote, peaceful, and untouched. I parked beside the cabin, unlocked the front door using the code the owner had sent me, and stepped inside. The air smelled like old wood and dust, not bad, just aged. There was a small kitchen to the left with a gas stove and an old white refrigerator that buzzed faintly. The cabinets were stocked with some basics: salt, pepper, tea bags, sugar, and a few cans of beans and soup. A wooden table and 2 chairs sat near the kitchen window. To the right, the living room had a stone fireplace, 2 armchairs, a lamp, and a tall bookshelf filled with paperbacks. In the back of the cabin, there was a single bedroom with a queen-size bed, a small dresser, and a nightstand. The sheets looked clean, though a bit faded. The bathroom was across the hall, tiny but functional, with a toilet, a sink, and a shower that ran hot after a few seconds of chugging and groaning. After unloading my bags, I changed into a pair of hiking pants and a sweatshirt, then made myself a sandwich. I sat outside on the porch and ate while listening to the birds. There was no traffic noise, no planes overhead, not even wind. Just the occasional call of a woodpecker or a squirrel rustling through leaves. I felt the tension in my back start to melt away. This was exactly what I needed. I spent the first afternoon walking around the edge of the lake, taking photos of the water and the trees, watching the sun drift across the sky. I saw deer tracks near the muddy banks and even found a trail that curved up a hill behind the cabin. I told myself I'd explore that the next morning. By evening, I had chopped a few logs with the hatchet out back and lit a fire inside. I made pasta, opened a beer, and read an old mystery novel I found on the shelf. I didn't check my phone once. I slept like a rock that night. It got colder than I expected, and I had to pull an extra blanket out of the closet, but I liked it. The next day, Friday, I got up early, made coffee, and set out to follow the trail I'd found. I packed a granola bar and a bottle of water and hiked for a couple of hours. The path went uphill for a while, then curved through a grove of pine trees. I didn't see anyone, not even a cabin or a shack, just forest. Eventually, I reached a ridge that overlooked the valley below. I sat down on a fallen log, breathed in the clean air, and thought about nothing for a long time. By the time I got back to the cabin, it was nearly 2 p.m. I heated up a can of soup, ate on the porch again, and spent the rest of the day reading and chopping more wood. I didn't think anything was off until that evening, when I went to grab my phone from my backpack to check the time. The battery had died. I thought I'd left it in airplane mode, but maybe I forgot. I didn't have any chargers that worked without an outlet, so I just left it in the bag and figured I'd check it on Sunday before driving home. I didn't care about missing calls. Nobody knew exactly where I was, but I had told my sister I'd be away and gave her the address just in case. It didn't seem like something to worry about. Saturday morning felt colder than the last two. I woke up with the feeling that something had changed, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I figured maybe it was just the temperature, or the fact that the sky looked overcast through the kitchen window. I made a quick breakfast, grabbed my jacket, and went outside to stretch. As I stepped off the porch, I noticed something strange near the tree line about 50 feet away. A small pile of broken branches had been arranged in a sort of circular pattern. It didn't look natural. The sticks were all the same size, snapped clean in the middle, and placed neatly in a shape that reminded me of a compass or a wheel. I stared at it for a few seconds. My first thought was that maybe some local kids had been up here messing around, but the land was private. The nearest house was supposed to be 5 miles away. Then I thought maybe an animal did it, though I couldn't think of any that would snap branches and lay them in a perfect circle. I walked over, crouched down, and studied the pattern. It didn't feel threatening, just strange. I kicked a few of the sticks aside, then stood and looked around. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anything either, just the trees creaking in the wind. I brushed it off and went back inside. The rest of the day was quiet. I didn't go far from the cabin. I kept glancing out the windows, half expecting someone to be standing in the trees watching me. But I never saw anything. That night, after dinner, I tossed more logs in the fire and read for a while. Around 10 p.m., I turned off the lamp and went to bed. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I couldn't explain why. There hadn't been a sound, at least none I remembered, but my body was on edge. The room was completely dark. I lay there for a few minutes, listening. First, it was just silence. Then I heard something. A soft, slow sound, like footsteps on dirt. I held my breath. It wasn't an animal. It had a rhythm to it, like someone was walking slowly around the cabin, circling it. I didn't move. I didn't even sit up. I just stared at the ceiling and listened. The steps came closer, then paused. Then a few more steps. Then silence. My heart was hammering. I reached slowly for the flashlight I'd left on the nightstand and clicked it on. But I didn't get up. I waited. The sound didn't come again. Eventually, after maybe 10 or 15 minutes, I heard a sharp knock. Not on the door, on the far wall of the cabin. Just once. Then nothing. I stayed awake until the sun came up. I didn't sleep a second after that knock. I didn't go outside either. I sat in the living room with the fireplace lit, staring out the front window, waiting for something. Anything. Around 7 a.m., I finally worked up the courage to open the door. The air was freezing. I stepped out and walked slowly around the cabin. I didn't see anyone, but on the far wall, near the rear window, there was a mark. A fresh scuff in the wood, maybe from a boot. Right below the window. That was enough for me. I went inside, packed my bags in a hurry, and locked the cabin behind me. I tossed everything in the car, turned the engine over, and backed down the dirt road as fast as I could without hitting anything. I didn't feel safe until I was back on the paved highway, phone finally charging, bars showing up again. I called my sister just to hear someone's voice, even though I didn't explain what happened. I got home that afternoon and didn't sleep for 2 days. I kept checking the locks. I kept the curtains closed. I emailed the owner of the cabin the next week. I didn't say much, just that I'd left early and that something felt off on the property. I never got a reply. When I went back to the listing to leave a review, it had been removed. I tried Googling the address. Nothing came up, not even a rental page. It was like it had never existed. I still think about that sound at night. Those footsteps. That knock. The pattern in the woods. I'll never know who or what was out there. But I know it was real. And I know it was close. Too close. I haven't gone back into the woods alone since. And I never will. I was 33 the year I decided to spend a week alone in a cabin in northern Idaho, near Priest Lake. It was early October 2017, the part of the year when the air turns dry and the nights feel sharper. I had just gone through a breakup and wanted time away from my job, my phone, and the noise of everything. I worked in Spokane as a mechanic, and the days were always loud. Clanking tools, hydraulic lifts whining, customers explaining noises their cars made using weird sound effects. I liked the work, but I needed quiet. I'd heard about a place from a coworker. His cousin owned a small off-grid cabin, deep enough into the woods that you couldn't hear any road traffic. It didn't even have cell service. That sounded like exactly what I needed. The guy agreed to let me use it free for a week, as long as I promised to clean up and not touch any of the equipment stored in the shed out back. I packed enough food for the week, filled 2 5-gallon jugs with water, loaded my truck with a sleeping bag, lanterns, and a few books. No laptop, no music. I didn't want any kind of distraction. I just wanted to sit in the middle of nowhere and clear my head. The drive took around 3.5 hours. The last 20 miles were on a dirt road that narrowed into a winding path. Trees leaned over it like they were closing in from both sides. Pine needles crunched under my tires, and chipmunks darted across the road every few minutes. It was cloudy the day I arrived, and by the time I pulled up to the cabin, the temperature had dropped into the low 50s. The cabin was small and basic. Wood exterior, 1 door, 2 small windows in the front. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by thick forest. No power lines, no mailbox, no driveway, just a patch of dirt and a rusty fire ring in front. The shed sat about 20 feet behind the cabin, older looking and locked with a heavy steel latch. I unloaded everything, carried it inside, and started getting the place set up. Inside, the cabin smelled like dry wood and something musty, like a mix of old books and wet leaves. The floor creaked, and the walls were lined with wooden planks. There was a cot with a foam mattress, a small table, 2 folding chairs, and a wood stove in the corner. A pile of chopped firewood was stacked beside it, and there were several extra blankets folded near the cot. A battery-powered lantern hung from a hook in the ceiling. That night, I made a fire in the stove, heated up a can of chili, and sat by the flames with a book in my lap. I remember the warmth of the fire and how quiet everything was. The kind of quiet you don't get in cities. The only sound was the wind through the trees and the occasional crackle from the stove. The first couple of days were peaceful. I went on long walks in the woods, always bringing a small GPS and a whistle just in case. I didn't see anyone else. No footprints, no wrappers, nothing to suggest people had been nearby recently. Just animal tracks in the dirt, deer mostly. I sat outside in the afternoons, watching the light change through the trees. I wrote a little in a notebook, made fires at night, read until I couldn't keep my eyes open, then fell asleep to the sound of the woods. But on the 4th day, things started to feel off. It was late afternoon, maybe around 4 p.m., and I'd just come back from a long hike. I sat on the steps of the cabin, drinking water, staring into the trees. That's when I noticed something, just a flicker of movement. I saw a shape between the trees about 50 yards out. At first, I thought it was a deer. I kept staring, waiting for it to move again. Didn't, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. After a few minutes, I went inside and closed the door. I told myself it was nothing, just shadows playing tricks on my eyes. That night, I heard something strange. It was about 2 a.m. I was half asleep when I heard what sounded like footsteps crunching in the leaves outside. They were slow, deliberate, like someone walking carefully through the woods. Then they stopped. The silence after was heavier than usual. I sat up and reached for the axe I kept near the bed. I didn't turn on the lantern. I just sat there, listening. After a few minutes, I heard the same sound again. Faint steps, this time moving away from the cabin. It was too heavy to be an animal. It sounded like a person. But who the hell would be out here at 2 in the morning? The next morning, I checked around the cabin. I didn't find anything unusual. No tracks, no damage, nothing disturbed. I tried to put it out of my mind. I spent the day chopping some wood and walking around the property. But I kept looking over my shoulder. That feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. On the 5th night, I locked the cabin door with a chain I'd brought and stacked some logs against it from the inside. I kept the axe beside my sleeping bag. I was nervous but figured maybe it was just my imagination. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of wood clinking. A faint sound, like something brushing against the logs I'd stacked at the door. I held my breath and listened. Nothing. Then, minutes later, another sound. Faint, like fabric brushing against wood. I didn't move. I just lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, holding the axe across my chest. I waited for more sounds, but eventually, I drifted off. The next morning, I found 2 things that made my stomach twist. First, one of the firewood logs I'd stacked in front of the door had fallen sideways, like someone had pushed it. Second, behind the cabin, I found a piece of orange fabric caught on a branch at about shoulder height. It looked like nylon. I didn't remember seeing it there before, and I hadn't walked back there since the first day. I circled the cabin for an hour, trying to find tracks or signs of someone. I didn't find much, just more broken branches and a small area near the edge of the clearing where the pine needles looked disturbed, like someone had stood there for a while. That day, I didn't go on any hikes. I stayed close, kept the fire going, and kept checking the woods every few minutes. I'd planned to stay the full week, but I decided I'd leave the next morning, a day early. I didn't feel safe anymore. That night was the worst. I didn't sleep. I stayed up with the lantern on low, listening. Just after 1 a.m., I heard a soft scraping sound on the outside wall, near the back of the cabin. It wasn't wind or branches. It was something deliberate. I got up slowly, moved to the side window, and tried to look out without being seen. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but the sound kept happening, slow and steady. Then it stopped. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps moving around the side of the cabin. They stopped by the front door. Then there was silence. I held the axe tighter and sat against the wall, heart pounding so hard I felt it in my throat. The next sound was so faint I almost thought I imagined it. A quiet click, like someone testing the door handle. I stayed absolutely still, trying not to breathe loud. After that, nothing. Total silence. I waited until dawn before I moved. When the sun came up, I opened the door and checked outside. No tracks, no signs of anyone. But I was done. I packed everything in under 10 minutes, threw it in the truck, and drove out of there without looking back. When I got back to Spokane, I didn't tell anyone the full story. I just said the cabin was too quiet, and I cut the trip short. But about a week later, I got a call from the guy who'd let me use the place. He asked if I'd left anything behind. I said no. Then he told me someone had broken into the shed behind the cabin. The padlock was missing, and some tools were gone. He thought maybe it had been animals, but the tracks around the shed looked like boot prints. He asked me if I'd noticed anything. I just said no. I never went back there, and I never asked for more details. But I still think about it. I think about the sounds I heard outside the walls. The firewood moved from the inside. The piece of orange fabric. I think someone was watching me, maybe even following me. Whoever it was didn't break in. Maybe they were just waiting. Maybe they liked seeing how close they could get without being caught. And maybe they weren't there for the tools in the shed. After that, I never stayed in an off-grid place again. I still go camping, but never alone, and never without a way to call for help. That trip changed the way I feel about the woods. I still love the quiet, but now I know that sometimes you're not as alone as you think.